an unfinished portrait of an unfinished life. Teddy, the brown filed spaniel, sat waiting by the door. All morning, a sad man named Parker had been moving purposefully around the four-story house. They were going somewhere. Parker had packed a bag the night before and spent the morning walking and feeding Teddy, closing and locking all the windows and doors. These actions meant a trip, and Teddy accepted that he was in for a long ride in a big black car. It wasn't always like this. Teddy was happy with Anne. What had happened before Anne? He imagined vaguely. She had been there for him as he grew from a puppy into an adult dog. They lived in an apartment in a big city in the South. Going out for walks, they rode the elevator. There were no stairs. In this same apartment building, there were only stairs, and a person was constantly walking up and down them. Teddy explored every floor except the last. They never went up to the fourth floor. Each floor of the house was as big as Anne's apartment, but they were cold, lonely spaces. Teddy missed Anne and her warm, sunny apartment. Teddy had lived with Anne for 6 years, though for the last year she had hardly been home. They went everywhere together, inseparable companions. If they rode in a car, it was in a yellow cab. Anne always sat in the back seat with Teddy. He'd sit at her feet and she'd put her arms around him. Parker, on the other hand, had a big black car called an SUV, and Teddy would be pushed into his back seat. It disturbed him, especially after he'd lost Anne. Trouble came with the smell. One morning, Teddy woke up on the corner of Anne's bed to a foreign odor. Teddy's nose was very sensitive. His breed is noted for its ability to sense what is hidden, what is masked by other odors. It was there, a faint, stupefying odor. He couldn't tell her about it. He had no way to warn her of the danger, but he became more affectionate to compensate. Time passed, and the odor acted on Anne more and more strongly. One day she left Teddy in the care of Liz, who lived in the apartment next door. Anne said to Liz, "Teddy is not used to being left alone. I'll be back tomorrow, just one night for tests." Liz had a cat named Simon who wouldn't leave Teddy alone. He insisted on rubbing up against the friendly brown dog. Because of Liz's cat, the spaniel had to stay in Anne's apartment alone. Liz was nice, but not Anne. Upon her return, Anne was gloomy. Teddy did his best to cheer her up. However, a period began when Anne would leave, always saying she would be back soon. The foul odor was strong when she left, and lessened upon her return. But it never completely disappeared. After Anne first left, Liz or another neighbor would come to feed and walk Teddy, but mostly he was left alone. Teddy would look forward to Anne's return, and for a while things would become almost normal. Except that Anne got weaker and weaker, and their walks got shorter and shorter. Soon they were hardly ever out of the apartment. Anne left for the last time, hugging Teddy tightly but not promising to return. Teddy waited and waited. At night, the apartment was dark and lifeless. Liz or someone else came once or twice a day. No more. Teddy was alone. And then the day came when Liz fed him and said with tears in her eyes, "This afternoon, your new master will come." That afternoon, a man named Parker came. There was a deep sadness emanating from him that Teddy could see and feel. Liz let Parker in, and they gathered Teddy's bowls and toys, the coat he wore in the winter, the rug and blanket he slept on. Parker put a leash on Teddy's collar and tried to lead him out of the apartment, but Teddy recoiled. He needed Anne. Parker seemed to understand. The man knelt down and said, "She ain't coming back, boy, and you know it. She died in the hospital, in the room next to the one my wife was in. They're both gone. I promised to take care of you." The man stroked Teddy's head and gave him a light pat, and Teddy got up and left the apartment. Teddy rode the elevator for the last time. He sat in the back seat of a big black car all alone, and they drove far away. Arrived at his strange house where they now lived alone, Teddy could smell the scent of the woman gone and the man's pain so similar to his own. They were together, but each was still alone. Parker Jones met his wife, Lenore, in Chicago during the summer of his second year of law school. At a college that primarily teaches physics, he entered law school expecting to become a patent attorney. However, the only summer internship he managed to get was at an arbitration firm. The arbitrators desperately needed someone knowledgeable in fiberglass wiring to help with a major construction case in Chicago. Parker, who had done cable installation for AT&T during college, accepted an out-of-state job. In Chicago, with nothing to do over the weekend, one Saturday morning he took a field trip to the Art Institute. Lenore, Len Campbell, was 23 years old and had a master's degree in fine arts. She painted in oils and acrylics, but couldn't find any other gainful employment except as a tour guide. Parker bought a ticket for the tour, but spent his time watching the pretty, petite, blonde tour guide. He followed her through the decorated rooms of the museum. He never worked up the courage to talk to the woman he liked. In all, he attended the tour 3 times in a row on Saturday morning. At the end of the 3rd tour, Lenore came up to him and said, "Hi, I'm Lenore, but people call me Len, and I'm also pretty impatient. So here's my phone number and address. I'm available every night except Tuesday." Lenore made the first move, and over the summer the relationship heated up. The introverted Parker quickly fell in love with the lively, outgoing Miss Campbell. The interaction was perfect. In a fit of passion, opposites attracted. They were both virgins and remained so until mid-August. Arriving at Lenore's apartment for a Friday night movie date, Parker found her roommate gone for the weekend. The movie ran on DVD in Lenore's bedroom. Lenore was on the pill just in case. They got very turned on by each other, but the first time didn't last long. Fortunately, they found that Parker recovers quickly and lasted much longer after the first time. Sunday morning came too early, however, and Lenore was pensive and a little aloof. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "No, only that our weekend was coming to an end. There will be other weekends. And weekdays, too. Unless this is your way of leaving me." "No, no," she said, moving in for a kiss. "I just can't keep working as a tour guide on minimum wage. I need a real job to pay my expenses until I'm an artist. I used to think success would come right away, but it didn't." "Well, you're very talented, and I'm sure you'll find something. I wish I could help, but I'm just a summer intern. I'll be fired at the end of the month." She laughed and said, "That's the thing. I found something. Next week, I'm starting a teacher training program in New York City at Brooklyn College. This will give me a degree in education and allow me to teach art in public schools." I planned our weekend with the understanding that it could be our last for a long time. Now it was Parker's turn. He laughed and said, "Funny. I'm going back to NYU the week after you leave for Brooklyn. They moved in together that fall and married the next year as soon as he graduated from law school. He was hired as a junior associate at an arbitration firm. It wasn't his dream job, but he took it to support them. Lenore had trouble finding work as a teacher. Until the birth of their first son, Daniel, she had worked part-time as a substitute teacher. The next year was spent caring for Daniel and painting. Being in the lowest position in the firm, Parker had to travel a lot. Returning from a trip to Buffalo, he found his wife waiting for him in a new nightgown with a bottle of champagne. "What's the occasion?" he asked. "I won," she replied. "You won?" "The Nevis Arts Prize for an oil painting." "Oh, congratulations!" The prize was a full $500, but more importantly, it came with a gallery show for the winning artists. The New York Times reviewed the exhibition and highlighted the work of emerging artist Len Campbell. A series of gallery shows followed, with one good review after another. Len's name became recognizable, but it didn't bring in much money. Daniel turned 5 and had to go to school. The question of public or private education came up, and by then he had a younger brother, Derek. While his parents were trying to decide whether they could afford private education, the State University of New York offered Len Campbell an assistant professorship in Albany. Parker was a junior partner by then, but didn't hesitate to pack up and move with his wife. It was the best decision for his family, although it did not advance his career. "I'll get some work," he told Lenore, and so it was he found work as a freelance arbitrator for minor building disputes. The Joneses bought a dilapidated house in one of the old industrial towns on the east side of the Hudson River and settled in. Len turned the top floor of the house into her studio. They had a decent income for upstate New York. Still, artist Len Campbell dreamed of someday having an exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. Parker's dream, on the other hand, was a happy, quiet life. When his second son went to college, he thought he had achieved it. But fate was not favorable to him. Lenore wasn't feeling well. After much debate, she followed his advice to take advantage of government medical benefits and get a physical exam. Thus began a long series of examinations, ending with a quiet conversation in the oncologist's office. Teddy was getting used to his new existence. Right outside the door was a park called Commons. Lots of dogs played there, and the people were friendly, but it wasn't the same. He missed Anne, and when it got colder in November, other dogs and people started showing up less and less often. It was much colder than in town, and they had few visitors, just the young man and his wife. The young man wasn't bad. It was Parker's son, Dan. He was tall like Parker and looked somewhat similar, but the woman, Dan's wife, didn't like dogs. Teddy noticed that. The woman annoyed Parker. She criticized his house for being old and their neighborhood for being poor. "Time to go," Parker said, grabbing his leash with one hand and his bag with the other. "The family would have to wait, and now that my Lenore is gone, we're at the mercy of the relatives for Thanksgiving." As they were about to leave, however, the phone rang. Parker picked it up. "Hello," he said. "Ah, yes. Sorry, I did not want to answer you. The thing is, I need more time." Parker paused, listening to the interlocutor. Teddy lay down on the floor. These calls were only making Parker sadder. "Yes, I know it's a great honor, and of course Lenore deserves it, but I can't part with her paintings yet. I need more time." Parker paused again, listening, then said, "I promise I'll make a decision soon." Parker hung up the phone and, turning to Teddy, said, "Come on, kid, it's time to go." With those words and his slumped shoulders, they left the house and crossed the small back garden, now dark and devoid of flowers, to the black car. Teddy climbed into the back for another long, unhappy ride. At the end of it, Teddy found himself in a place with perfect lawns and remarkably similar houses. It seemed like they were outside the city, but there were fewer trees than in the city, and none of the streets went straight, but seemed to wind endlessly. Dan met his father and Teddy at the door. He put his arm around the older man. Looking past the men, Teddy noticed a frown slip across the woman's face, replaced by an artificial smile. They were led into a room at the back of the house. There seemed to be almost no stairs here, as everything was on one level. However, there was a cat here named Samantha, a large yellow tabby that hissed at Teddy and then scurried away. Parker settled in the back room and then took Teddy out for long walks. When not walking, Teddy was confined to the back room, but apparently Parker was too, or at least he preferred to stay there with Teddy rather than spend time with his relatives. Parker, Teddy realized, shared the same deep sadness. They had both lost the one person who made their lives livable. The next day was crowded, and in the late morning the guests began to arrive. Teddy was taken out to greet them. The cute brown dog with a friendly and affectionate personality immediately took a liking to the guests. Earlier in the day, Parker took Teddy for a walk through the winding, narrow streets of the village. When they returned, Parker's son, Dan, was talking to the couple in the foyer, picking up their coats. "Oh, Dad," Dan said, "let me introduce you to Professor Stevenson and his wife." "Hi, Jean," Parker addressed the red-haired woman. She turned to her husband and said, "Frank, this is Parker Jones. His wife was in the hospital at the same time you were." "It's nice to finally meet you," Parker said, extending his hand. Frank Stevenson was a very tall, thin man with the too-gray pallor of a man recovering from a long illness. It was also noticeable that he was nearly 2 decades older than his wife, a woman in her 30s. Stevenson accepted Parker's hand reluctantly, with a resentment that Teddy could feel. Perhaps it was Parker's good health or the warm smile his wife bestowed on a man a good dozen years younger than her husband. "Oh, is that Teddy?" Jean Stevenson exclaimed. Jean squatted down to pet Teddy, and when he hugged her in return, she laughed with delight. "Oh, I've heard so much about you from Anne. She was a splendid woman, and I know you must miss her. But now you have a wonderful man as your master." Rising to her feet, she said, "I'm so glad you took Teddy, fulfilled Anne's last wish. I know he'll have a good home with you." Jean paused and added, I was so sorry to hear about Lenore. Perhaps it was for the best. New York was our last hope. Lenore fought to the end, but there comes a point when the fight becomes worse than the disease. I know she and Ann are together somewhere, watching over Teddy and me. That's when Dan, Parker's son, burst in. Squeezing his father's hand, he said, "That's right, Dad. Stay positive. And by the way, you and Professor Stevenson will have a lot to talk about. He was my contracts professor at Albany Law School. I told him you were an arbitrator in the construction industry." Frank Stevenson nodded his head to Parker and moved toward his wife, putting his arm around her waist. Frank's movement brought him closer to Teddy, who caught the subtle odor and jumped away from the stranger to hide behind Parker. "What's the matter, boy?" Parker asked, stroking Teddy's head. "Maybe all these new faces are overwhelming him," suggested Jean. "Yeah, we're getting too crowded for one dog," Dan remarked, waving the Stevensons toward the living room. Leaving, Jean said to Parker, "We should exchange updates later." Jean smiled sadly at Parker over her shoulder as her husband's hand nudged her forward. Parker, for his part, was full of memories. The experimental cancer research was taking place in New York City at Sloan Kettering. The journey was long, but it was their last hope for remission of the cancer that was killing Lenore. They checked in at 5 in the morning on the day of her initial exam. Lenore was wheeled away on a gurney and gave Parker formal instructions on where to wait. Parker wandered around looking for the waiting room, asking one volunteer and another where he should wait. They tried to help him, but didn't seem to have any idea. Finally, a nurse going off duty pointed in the right direction and he found the waiting room. It was a quiet place with the only TV on, turned on to an appropriately monotonous program. Fortunately, he settled in with the book he had brought with him. The waiting area was relatively empty in the early morning hours. The only people here were Parker, an older woman with a young man who might have been her grandson, and an attractive red-headed woman leafing through old magazines in the waiting room. Time was passing. The room grew crowded, then empty. Only the red-haired woman remained unchanged. It was past 1 o'clock when his cell phone rang. A nurse called and said that his wife was being admitted to the hospital and that he could visit her after 5 o'clock in the evening. "There's a decent cafe a few blocks from here," said the red-haired woman standing next to him. Her name was Jean Stevenson, and her husband, Frank, was undergoing the same cancer treatment as Parker's wife. "He's been fighting cancer for almost 5 years now," Jean said over a light green salad at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. "For us, it's been 2 years," Parker said, staring at his turkey but still unable to convince himself to take a bite. "But it feels like it's been longer, almost an eternity. And yet, time is so short," Parker reflected. Jean was 37, already married for a dozen years to her former law professor, a man 15 years older than her. She was childless and the only survivor of her own family. Frank was having his second bout of cancer, or third, depending on how you count them. She volunteered the details of her life. She was a person desperate for an interlocutor who could understand her. Parker's great gift as an arbitrator was that people instinctively felt they could trust him. Parker always showed his natural empathy. In this case, however, he and Jean Stevenson shared a common experience and a similar desperate need. "You can't convey how you feel, and you dare not show your fear," Parker admitted. "Always have to stay positive," Jean replied. They smiled at each other, 2 people stuck in their roles as caregivers. It was their first time together. 2 people who had come to support their spouses, coming together for mutual support. They were lonely, because in caring for another, they were separated from the flow of the living world around them. Naturally, they were drawn to share their burdens together. The hospital had lists of restaurants and hotels that gave special rates to the families of patients. Jean and Parker naturally began to dine together late after visiting hours, often staying at the same hotel. This happened in late December, just before Christmas. In anticipation of the holiday, New York City was lit up. There was merriment everywhere, but for Jean and Parker it was a somber time. Lenore lay in the same room with Ann Cummings, a book editor whose family consisted of a brown dog named Teddy. That morning, Parker arrived at the hospital and found that Ann and Lenore had been moved to separate rooms. He had spent enough time in the hospital to know that this was not a good sign. Both women were losing their battle with the disease. That night at dinner, Jean was in even worse shape than Parker. "We had a fight," she said. "There was no good news today, and I guess Frank didn't have a more convenient punching bag." "It's complicated," Parker consoled. "Pain is bad, but fear is worse. Lenore is in a private room right now." "It may not mean what you think it means," John said, reaching out her arms to cover him with them. "I'm not alone in my thoughts. Her roommate, Anne, has also been moved, and she has asked me to take her dog with me during her absence. You move to a single room when you think the end is near. Anne understands that, and so does Lenore." Jean turned away, struck by the grief of the man on the other side of the table. Noticing that the waiter was visibly fidgeting, Jean said, "Oh, we should go." It was getting close to 11 o'clock. The hotel staff was waiting for the restaurant to close. They walked to Jean's room together. Usually he left her at the door and went to his room. But this evening she invited him in. For 5 years now, Jean Stevenson had hardly made love. At the best of times, it was Frank who had been the one who had pursued a relationship with her. Like most women, even after marriage, she had had a hard time finding common ground with her own sexuality. But as sexual intimacy gradually waned, and then, as the disease progressed, disappeared altogether, Jean experienced a deep sense of loss. She longed for the intimacy that arose with a man. Parker had been celibate for almost 2 years. In bed, Lenore was usually shy, but always lost her shyness in the thrill of their mutual pleasure. Lenore was an artist, and Parker was a practical, down-to-earth person. In bed with Lenore, however, he learned to be an artist, playing with all the colors of her sexual desires. He developed a palette with which to paint a portrait of their marital love. In John's hotel room, 2 unwilling celibates awkwardly reached for each other. 2 desperate people in need of physical connection. "Would you like a drink?" Jean asked. "I'd love one." It had been a rough day. The drink was followed by a kiss, and it had a much more arousing effect. "We shouldn't do this," Jean said as their lips parted. "You're right," Parker replied, kissing her again. The very thought of sleeping with a man who was not her husband was both unthinkable and at the same time extremely exciting for Jean. As with most women, the most exciting thing about being married for years was the thought of making love with a man other than her husband. Not that wives were inherently unfaithful, but no woman's romantic dreams involved fidelity. Jean gave herself over to a moment of escape from the painful reality of her life. She clung to a man who was also drowning, and together they made it to the lifeboat of oblivion in a sea of despair. In the morning, Jean awoke to find Parker already awake and sitting up. He sat perfectly still and stared out the window. The window overlooked a dreary city street and a sterile office building. "Do you feel guilty?" Jean asked. "Of course I do," he replied. "Do you?" "Same," she said, sitting up and moving so that her naked body was next to his. "But I'm not sorry," Parker said, and turned to kiss her. "Neither am I," she said as their lips met. So it started with what was supposed to be a one-time thing. John had stopped by the pharmacy to pick up a morning-after pill, just a precaution, but she had considered it a week before her blunder. She soon had more reliable contraception, another precaution, but one that proved necessary. As the harsh New York winter turned to a wet spring, they abandoned all pretense and gave up 2 rooms in favor of 1. Parker never stopped feeling guilty, but he never thought of ending the affair. He divided his existence into 2 spheres. It allowed him to stay sane while watching cancer take away everything that had meaning in his life. He supposed it was the same with Jean, but they never talked about it. Now it had become a taboo topic in the air bubble they occupied when they were together. Every morning he left Jean to take his place at Lenore's bedside. Each evening brought a man devastated by heartache back to a woman who suffered no less. They embraced each other, wiping away tears, and pretended this world was real. In June, everything changed. Summer was only a week away, but it was hot and humid. It was as uncomfortable as New York could be. He made his way to the hospital from his hotel through the morning heat. Already upon arrival, he realized something was wrong. The nurses were silent, but their faces told him that the end was near. Lenore spent the day with a clearer mind than she had weeks before. They talked about little things, reminiscing about their years together. What Dan had been like at 2 years old, and how different Derek had been as a baby. She slept for a while and woke up in the afternoon. "I'm sorry, Ed," she said suddenly. He was sitting by her bedside, half asleep, watching the depressing news on the cable TV in the room. It took him a moment to respond. "Forgive." "For what, my love?" "For this. For all of it. For putting you through this." He took her hand. "Hey, it's not your fault. Things happen. We'll get through this together. You'll see." He took her hand and smiled encouragingly, he hoped. "No, I can't do this anymore. It's coming to an end." "I'm sorry," she said, tears running down her face. He was crying, too. They sat like that. She reminisced about their life together for a long time. She made him promise to move on. "Find someone else," she said. "Don't make her make the first move like I had to." He stayed at her bedside for the rest of the day. At 5 o'clock, she closed her eyes, slipped into a coma. Just after midnight, an alarm sounded on the monitors, but not a scream. It was an anguished plea. A nurse came in. A DNR order had been signed the day before. Lenore, wife, mother, lover, slipped away. When Parker returned to the hotel early in the morning, he expected to find Jean. But her things were gone. Neither was the note. She hadn't left a goodbye message. He later learned that her husband had been discharged. It was a complete remission, one of the success stories of the new treatment. He visited Anne in the hospital to say goodbye, finding her in poor health. "I'm sorry about Lenore," she began. "I'm not supposed to know, but you always hear the whispers." "She just gave up," Parker said. "No," Anne said, grabbing his arm with all the strength she still had left. "She had accepted the inevitable. That's exactly what she did. Now it's my turn." "Don't say that." "Why, because it's not true? No, I only have one regret. Poor Teddy's all alone in a dark apartment. Liz, my neighbor, walks him and feeds him, but she can't take him in because of her cat. He is good with cats, but the cat is not good with him. Poor Teddy is waiting for me to come back, but I think he knows it's a lost hope. I guess he realized I was sick before the doctors did. I've been told dogs can smell cancer. Spaniels are the best. They can detect very faint odors. My poor boy, he needs someone, and I think you need him. Please take him." Parker took Teddy. They traveled a long way upstate. The dog and the man were both grieving. They arrived at an empty house. Teddy wandered through the floors, all but the fourth. At the very top of the house was Lenore's old studio. That floor was off limits. Parker wouldn't go there, couldn't face his grief. Like Teddy, he lived with a hope that was impossible. Thanksgiving dinner at the younger Parker's house was a strange event. There were about 20 people in attendance, several family members, and social and professional acquaintances of the newly married couple. Dinner had been ordered, and no one could object to the quality or quantity of the food. However, the elder Parker ate very little and shared most of the meal with Teddy, who was in the back room for the duration of the feast. After dinner, Parker, avoiding socializing, went outside with Teddy. When they had walked only a short distance, Jean caught up with them. They took a seat on a lonely bench that stood slightly off the roadway near what appeared to be a bus stop, a deserted spot in a neighborhood of single-family homes with 2-car garages. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Sure," he replied, sitting down. Teddy settled at his feet. "I'm sorry I didn't say goodbye," she began. "There was no need," he said. "We didn't have a real relationship. We were just sharing a bed for the sake of convenience." She sobbed slightly at his words and said, "I deserved it, I suppose. But we both know we had something much more than that." She paused for a moment. Both were silent, and then she said, "I love you. I realize this shouldn't have happened. Of course I didn't want it to. But it happened, and then Frank got better. I didn't know how to tell you. I couldn't find the words to say goodbye." Parker turned to her. She was crying. "Please, don't," he said. "I realize he's your husband and he needs you. We've gone too far. It's no one's fault." Forgive me, she begged. There's nothing to forgive. But you're alone. He tugged Teddy's leash in response, and the dog looked up at them. You're forgetting about Teddy, he said. Jean leaned forward and stroked Teddy's head. He licked her hand, and she smiled back. He's a good companion, but still. We both have a bond that is growing. He has a depth of pain I can't yet understand, and he's trying to understand me. It's a work in progress. We are the continued living. Lenore and Anne's obituaries were published on the same day. It said this, alive in their memory. They listed all their accomplishments, but both obituaries ended the same way. Alive in their memories. It's up to us now. We have to find our way. And we're working on it, aren't we, boy? Teddy's look was sad even for a spaniel, and Jean wondered how much the dog could understand. Did he really feel the deep grief of the man sitting next to her? I have to go back, she said. I understand. We'll be there soon. On the way, Jean wiped her tears and fixed her makeup. She had made the only possible choice, but she was already regretting it. Early the next morning, before his sister-in-law got up, Parker was ready to leave. No sooner had he slipped out than his son Dan stopped him for a hug and a request. I got another call from the Art Institute of Chicago. They still want to do an exhibit of Mom's work. They have most of her paintings in the public domain and many from private collections, but they want her most recent works and you still have them, Dan said. I know, Parker said. They call me all the time. What's the problem, Dad? It's just, he started. It's hard to explain. You can't let her go, Dan prodded. In a way, I guess. Some part of me thinks the same as Ted, Parker said, petting the dog. He's still hoping his mistress will come for him and take him home. He must realize that's not going to happen, but he hasn't given up hope. As they parted, Dan hugged his father tightly and said, We need you, Dad. Please come back soon. Parker promised to come back when he could. Before driving home, Parker put Teddy in the front passenger seat of the car. Well, behave yourself, Ted. Sit on the floor and behave yourself. Teddy got the hang of it, and along the way, whenever he could, Parker leaned over and stroked Teddy's head. The dog seemed much happier with this arrangement. Parker realized that they finally understood each other. When they got home, they had a late lunch of Teddy's favorite meal, chicken and rice. After lunch, they took a long walk. Finally, for the first time together, they climbed the stairs to the top of the building. There, Teddy saw Lenore's studio for the first time. It smelled of paint and turpentine and the musty odor of a long, unused room. Along two walls were composed canvases. One wall had unfinished works and supplies, the other wall had finished works. Parker settled into a chair set in the center of the room. Teddy sat at his feet, resting his head on Parker's lap. Nearby stood an easel with an unfinished painting, Len Campbell's last work, waiting for the woman who would not return. It was a portrait of her husband. Parker's unfinished image only remotely resembled himself. It was a portrait of a much younger man, happy, deeply in love. A portrait of a quiet guy following a pretty blonde tour guide at an art museum. The image of a young father and loving husband who agreed for their sake to take the job he could get. It was not a portrait of a survivor, but an unfinished portrait of an unfinished life. Light streamed through the skylight. Parker pulled a crumpled news clipping from his pocket. It occurred to me that I never read Anne's obituary to you. Teddy didn't move as Parker read the death notice of Anne Cummings, a well-known book editor. Reaching the end, he said, And here's the part about you. Alive in the memory of her beloved and faithful dog, Theodore Bear Cummings, Teddy. Parker paused, and a tear rolled down his cheek. Then he stood up. It's time to clear this room, Teddy. Take these paintings to the Art Institute. It's just the two of us, but we've got to move on. Teddy reached up, scratched his ear, and followed Parker, but he knew he was wrong. They wouldn't be alone for long. A woman named Jean must come in. He caught her husband's scent. It was faint, but growing stronger. You can't fool a dog's nose. Frank Stevenson's cancer is back. Soon there would be 3 survivors, bound by shared pain and doomed to live after tragedy. The end.